Hello, this is BBC News. I'm Chris Rogers. We'll be taking a look at how the newspapers are reacting to the events in Paris very shortly. Let's just bring you up to date with our latest headlines, though. High security on the streets of Paris tonight as new footage emerges of police exchanging fire with gunmen during last night's attacks. Prosecutors confirmed 129 are dead, 350 injured, many critically. 8 gunmen wearing suicide vests targeted half a dozen venues. 7 of the gunmen blew themselves up. The 8th was shot dead by police. David Cameron says Britain's terror threat remains at severe level, but the attacks would prompt a review. Well, welcome to our special edition of The Papers, looking at how the papers continue to report on the developments in Paris and the reaction as well. Tonight we are joined by French-Algerian journalist Nabila Ramdani. We're also joined by Robert Fox, defence editor for the London Evening Standard. We're also in Paris for the papers as well for this programme. At our studio there, France 24's Lila Jacinto also joins us. Good evening to you all. Well, let's just have a look at some of the front pages we've already had in before we discuss them in detail. We'll start with the French papers, and this is Le Figaro. Sorrow and anger is the translation of that headline, and the picture it uses just says it all, doesn't it? Libération has a dramatic front page. It's publishing a special edition about the events in Paris. Well, on to the British papers. The Sunday Telegraph has a striking picture of the people hanging out of windows trying to escape the attackers. The Observer focuses on the investigation into those behind the attack, saying 3 people have been arrested. This is the Daily Mail claiming that the attackers entered Europe as fake refugees. And the Sunday Express says the SAS is on the streets of London as Paris mourns the dead. The Sunday Times has pictures of the first victims to be named, including Briton Nick Alexander, who worked for the band playing at the Bataclan when the crowd was attacked. And The Independent asks, how did it happen and what happens next? And they are questions many of the newspapers do try to find the answers to as well. First of all, let's go to Paris. Let's go to you, Leila, where many of the French newspapers really have had their first proper opportunity to digest what happened in Paris and react and ask those questions. And Le Figaro very much focusing on how Parisians must be feeling right now.
Yes, and you know what the constant theme that I'm hearing right now is how different these attacks are from the Charlie Hebdo attacks, which happened in Jan 7th to 9th. At that time, there was really a sense of rallying together. Je suis Charlie was the slogan, and now you know there's a certain amount of disquiet and also anger. There's a very defiant spirit here, and if you see the Figaro, which is a right-center newspaper, you know, below the sorrow and anger, there is we will win the war. You know, so that's a theme that I'm seeing this time that I didn't really see after the Charlie Hebdo attacks.
And is how newspapers like Le Figaro are reporting on the events of Paris, is that changing as well? Is there a different tone?
No, on the reporting, it's been pretty straightforward. You know, all of Saturday, they were, you know, most of the news was driven by information coming from police sources, which was actually confirmed later this evening when the Paris prosecutor, François Molin, had a press briefing. So, you know, it's been very much focused on what happened, and of course, you know, a lot of victim stories because you know this is a part of Paris that has, you know, Paris is not a very large city, so it's touched a lot of Parisians.
Nabila, what do you make of Le Figaro? It's so many British papers, which we'll get onto very shortly, are focusing on the investigations, the reaction, some of the footage and photos still emerging. Le Figaro, and we'll get onto Libération in a moment, very much focusing on the grief.
Well, indeed, and it's a very passionate editorial, it has to be said, and you only have to look at the title, which is very belligerent. It's a nation at war. And what the editorial goes over, basically, is how France was lulled in this false sense of security in the post-Charlie Hebdo attacks. And now with these attacks happening again, but on a much wider scale, basically the editorial argues that France have to wake up, and they paint a picture, a very dramatic picture of a clash of civilizations, basically between us and them, the abomination of the so-called Islamic State and the defense of French values and Western values. And they argue that, if we are to defeat those evils, we're not going to achieve that by slogans, tweets, marches in central Paris, or, confronting them with secular values. We have to be, a bit more belligerent than that.
So, Rob, already French newspapers, less than 24 hours after the attacks, very different to last time, are starting to ask quite provocative questions about where do we go, is it worth it, should we continue to get more involved, what are the politicians discussing right now? And let's just show Liberation as well, which has a very striking front page.
Yeah, very powerful, very stark, no text at all, and it's black. The figure of Editorial is interesting in several respects. It uses war. It takes President Hollande at his word and says, we're going to make war. And it has a rather chilling line, this army of crime, this army of criminals, which we are now seeing. We know les chefs, the commanders, are abroad, and we must attack them. Interestingly, its international edition emanates from Paris as well. The New York Times has been taking up much the same line. Very strange reporting in the afternoon edition today. I've been looking at it online, saying now is the time to really get serious about the attack on ISIL Daesh in Syria, in Iraq. I've just been on a sister channel, 5 Live, arguing with James Woolsey, the former director of the CIA, saying, yeah, get in, bash them. That's the way we've been weak about the air operation. And I made the point there to him, which I make to this. In military terms, this is saying there is a centre of gravity. That is the thing. If you pull it apart, the whole thing falls apart. You can hit ISIL in Raqqa, in Ramadi, in Mosul, and that's it. Well, what we have learnt from this, and what we have learnt from the week's events, including the bombing of the Russian airliner, the terrible attacks in Baghdad, again on soft targets by ISIL, and in Beirut, it isn't as easy as that. It isn't just taking out 2 or 3 capitals on the provincial centres on the ground, although they're an important part of the story, as I think we'll discover.
Leila, I mean, what do you think people in Paris want to see? Do they want to see Liberation with the roses there and the very black and respectful front page, or do they want to hear from the politicians? What are they discussing? What are they going to do about this?
I don't think they want to hear from the politicians. I think they're sort of terrified about when and it surely will, this issue will get politicized. For now, the politicians are rallying together. President Hollande is going to be addressing Parliament on Monday. Everybody's making the right noises, but this will surely become politicized. When we first started getting reports that there was a Syrian passport discovered on the scene, there was alarm among some of my French colleagues of Algerian origin, because, does this mean that Marine Le Pen is going to, is the next target going to be the migrants now?
I just want to get your reaction to the Mail on Sunday here in the UK. Its focus very much on how the Islamic extremists got into Paris, how they got there, and their headline is Paris jihadis got in as fake refugees. What is the strength of feeling about the migrant crisis, about borders? Do you... of course, it's difficult, isn't it? Because, if you're going to protect your borders, you're doing what the Islamic extremists exactly want you to do and lose your freedom.
By and large, the French are committed to the European Union and to the spirit of the European Union. And, they did not take to Cameron's speech last week very well. There is really a sense of shock, and mind you, there's a state of emergency in Paris right now, which is, we haven't seen this for a decade. Not much really being said, as far as I can tell, on the borders. People just seem to take it as a given, you know, that security measures have to be tightened. We were already in a state of alert after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and people seem to be accepting that, you know, security is going to be tight right now.
Yeah. Do you see many headlines like that even before the terrorist attacks last night in French newspapers? Do you see reports about how dangerous the migrant crisis could be for security?
Well, that depends on which paper you read. The Libération, certainly not.
Yeah. A bit like here. I mean, Nabila, we do know, and the Daily Mail, the Mail on Sunday goes into this, that we've heard from Greece now saying that they believe it is highly likely at least one of the gunmen could have got into France via Greece. Of course, what we do know is that a Syrian passport was left near the bodies of one of the gunmen.
I mean, I think that kind of stories always going to be inevitable, that you have a link between what's happened in Paris and indeed the wider political situation across Europe, as it were. But I mean, there are conflicting reports about what the Greeks are actually saying. It's all apparently still based on claims, and if I may put it that way, and probabilities, the conclusion is not that conclusive, and that's highlighted.
The Daily Mail doesn't think so. I mean, one of the inside headlines, Rob, Med boat secret cargo jihadis bound for Britain as well.
Yeah, but if you read the text in the other papers, like the Sunday Times and the Observer, one of the leaders identified as, Lila would probably comment on this, as Ismail M, came from Croissant, if that's the right area of the district from which the Kouachi brothers came. There's something indigenous about this. Yes. It's very interesting that the serious papers actually get into the entrails of this. This is a very, very difficult and extremely complex case. Well, it is both domestic and global. It does have reference there. And one of the best pieces I've read, I mean, by a friend, and it just came up, I'm sure there are other interesting, insightful pieces which I haven't yet scanned, because the papers are just coming off the press from the Sunday Times and others, is Patrick Coburn's excellent piece in the Independent. Says what's old and what's new about it. And very simply, he makes the point, I mean, we're old friends, but we're in total agreement. He is saying, what is new about this is the sophistication of the mounting of the attack. This was a kamikaze attack, rather like the Mumbai attack on the hotel district in 2008 in India and Mumbai. The attackers were expendable. This is the most dreadful side. They were dead men once they got up, once they got out of their vehicles, which is another story. Exactly what vehicles do they get out, why, who provided all the stuff. But to get all that gear into the right place, at the right time, with a reliability that somebody was going to do that dreadful stuff in the concert hall. This is the really interesting one, the concert hall, and going around to 4 restaurants and firing off a magazine or 2 each time, getting back in the car and then going on. Tells you a hell of a lot about the lack of surveillance on Paris streets. And there is another almost mad description which comes up in 2 or 3 of the papers of one of the attackers allegedly trying to get into the Stade de France when the match was already on. And more or less, the security on the gate says, go away. They'd spotted something. They'd spotted the suicide vest. Allegedly, and there are several accounts of this, he steps back, blows himself up. They hear it inside the stadium, and the match goes on.
Yes.
It's very, very odd indeed. And then they hustle Monsieur le Président out of the stadium. Was he the target?
It could have been so much worse. It's bad, but it could have been...
I mean, I'm not criticising the journalism, because I think it's been excellent. It's one of these things. You and I, all 3 of us, all 4 of us, will have been on these rolling stories where bit after bit after bit, and the canvas is very, very rich, and it's very complex. And the more established journalists, like my friend Kim Sen-Gupta of the Independent, says, look, we are struggling to work out is what is old and what is new about it. But the man who actually nails it is Patrick, and says that Patrick Coburn, he said, ISIS is now going for soft targets wherever.
And Nabila, the Independent also not just asking how it happened, also what happens next. And that's what everybody's talking about as well.
Yes, and absolutely. And that's why I slightly disagree with Leila when she says the French don't want to hear about or from politicians. I think what the Libération front page is doing is putting in its very sombre front page the emphasis on grief and mourning and respect for the dead. But the next step is surely for the government to answer questions. You know, how did that happen? Can we know more about it? And as it stands, the investigation remains very sketchy indeed. It's all based on claims, allegations. And at this stage, I would be very suspicious about the kind of things that are presented as facts, like the Syrian passport, which, you know, seems to be planted next to a body. We've seen that in the case of the Charlie Hebdo attacks with the Kouachi brothers, and one of the brothers had, you know, forgot his identity card in the car. I think we have to take all these clues with a bit of caution.
Leila, you're listening to this from our Paris studio. I just want to bring you in on the Sunday Telegraph, which does report on how world leaders are now discussing military action against Islamic State. Of course, for a lot of people in Paris tonight, they might not want more military action. They've already felt what that can lead to, but it might actually increase a lot of people's feelings that we need to be more involved. I mean, is that the kind of thing you're hearing in Paris, what the Sunday Telegraph is reporting, that there could be more military action, or there should be?
Well, I mean, France is very active militarily in the fight against jihadist groups. You know, whether it's in North Africa, it was you know, Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. France has been targeting oil refineries in Syria, and Boko Haram, which is, you know, the Nigerian group that has pledged allegiance to ISIS. So the French are used to a very robust military involvement. They're sort of raising their eyebrows that a socialist president like Hollande seems so much more gung-ho than his British and US counterparts on the Syrian tragedy. They tend to think, like many people, you know, in the Syrian conflict after all these years, is that what are we doing with, you know, rebel partners that we can't really trust. So there's not really that much of an appetite for military involvement, but there is an understanding that France is a big player, a big military player on the international scene.
The Sunday Times really takes it back to how people are feeling and how they're reacting right now, while papers like The Telegraph kind of look ahead. They show the images of victims as the names of victims continue to emerge, and there's 129 right now, with many more injured. What strikes me, Nabila, about the Sunday Times is how young some of those faces are. Of course, only one of them confirmed here at the BBC has been the Brit Nick Alexander.
Well, yes, indeed, and this comes as no surprise, dare I say, because the 10th and the 11th arrondissement of Paris are very youthful areas, frequented by young people, you know, and they have been described by commentators as areas, you know, frequented by liberal, you know, open-minded young men and women who effectively represent the opposite of what ISIS stands for, and that's why they would have been a prime target. ISIS resents that kind of joie de vivre, that kind of, you know, what you would do on a Paris street. You know,
Rob, do you think they were targeting young people anywhere in Paris? It was they didn't go.
I think that was the sideshow, and I'd be very interested to hear what Leila's got to say about it. It seemed to be the main effort was the start, the France, and then let's do a lot of business around and about. They knew the district very well.
Okay, well, Leila, what do you think?
No, I couldn't agree with you more. You know, these were not obvious targets. These are very popular. You have to be a real Parisian. You have to be a Parisian in your 30s or, you know, late 20s. The Carillon, you know, the Canal Saint-Martin. so it's obviously somebody from the inside who has picked these targets, soft targets for sure. You know, the Stade de France seemed like a more obvious targets, and you know, the parallels with the Mumbai attacks are very stark here. But you know, no five-star hotels, and you know, no Westgate Mall that we saw in Nairobi. These really are places where, you know, the super rich, the capitalists don't hang around. This is really just a young crowd. That's what made it really shocking.
It gives you that sense, and it will certainly give many people the sense that now we really are not safe anywhere, Rob. It's not just big events. It can just be having a drink with a friend.
Yeah, but it's also the time mechanism. I mean, I'm sorry, I have more questions than answers, but it's a thing that we've got to establish. And again, the only person that I've seen mentioning it, and I've been banging on about it all day, this is multidimensional. There is something very conventional, too, about what ISIL does. It actually declared an Islamic State, and it's an Islamic State which has a ground truth. It is between Ramadi and Raqqa, and it's got to hold that land, and it has been losing a lot of ground over the last 2 or 3 weeks. It's lost Sinjar just at the end of the week, which is vital in terms of the communications and smuggling routes. By that, I mean, it's not a romantic side. Those are the routes you use if you're going to truck out oil into Turkey, into Syria, from Iraq, and so on. This is getting to be quite a body blow to them, and there seems to be something going on saying, look, for goodness sake, let's have diversionary action. So we've had these terrible attacks, which haven't been given the full coverage they deserve, on civilians in Lebanon and in Baghdad. We had the bomb, and that was quite clearly an ISIL affiliate. And now this. It is to show that we're all conquering. And again, to quote Patrick Coburn, it's to say that we can hit soft targets wherever. And that is part of the terror side of it. It's kamikaze stuff, and it's vulgar and it's indiscriminate. But that's the horrible side about it, and which strikes, because it's so irrational, it strikes a sort of intellectual terror, if I can put it.
Interesting, though, that it's clearly a massive PR coup, if I may put it bluntly. You know, what terrorists do is they want to strike fear and attract maximum publicity by doing so, and that has been achieved. But what Patrick is saying is it reflects a sign of desperation. Actually, they are losing ground. Well, in their state, they are being pushed back. In
Iraq and in Syria.
In Western Iraq
they go
and
out
Eastern
to attack
Syria.
us on our home soil. I mean, it was quite interesting.
And it's losing its title as the premier jihadi flag bearer. Now, that's what happened. See, that's what happened with Zarqawi. That's what happened with various affiliates of Al-Qaeda, that they lose the brand leadership. And there's something going on there. And there's a really wicked mind, a cool, wicked mind behind this, because I suspect in a lot of the MO, the modus operandi, I see, I'll bet there are 1 or 2 of those really tough Chechens that have been behind the forces in ISIL land, where the IS is, particularly in Iraq. Hey, here's a funny thing. They picked a concert hall. The Chechens like doing that. Think of Beslan, think of the theatres in Moscow, because it's a confined space with very young people.
And it's an easy target.
An easy target.
But, you know, and then the Observer picks up on this.
Sorry, I think
in its front page. Let's just bring Leader in, because I'd like to hear what she has to say about this. 3 held as Paris police hunt for clues to ISIS killer squads. And what's interesting is, and the Observer says this as well, doesn't it, that by launching attacks like this, they do expose themselves. They do expose into how they may do the next attack, where they may do it, how they're getting arms in. It leaves clues, doesn't it?
Yeah, but, you know, I mean, one very important thing about these attacks is that, you know, France has seen lone wolf attacks. You know, a Frenchman was arguably the first blowback of the Syrian conflict, Mehdi Nemouche, who targeted the Belgian, the Jewish Museum in Brussels. This is very different. This is coordinated, and also the claim came very quickly, the very next day. It's also the first suicide attack. So, you know, going back to this whole business of the caliphate, I really think we're getting it wrong by saying, you know, on a day after, or, you know, hours after our Kurdish allies entered Sinjar, you know, this very coordinated attack that almost seems to, you know, we don't use the word central command. We used to use that term for Al-Qaeda. But now it really shows that it sort of does not matter what's happening in Syria and Iraq. And in a way, maybe you're right, the desperation will, will trigger these kinds of attacks. But, we saw with the Russian plane, we saw with the Beirut attacks on the Hezbollah neighborhood, the global jihad, ISIS's global reach is becoming much more sophisticated. And for a year, we thought, oh, they're just concentrating on holding territory and administering territory. It's gone to a different game now.
I think that is really the key point, is that they're saying, no, we're not going to be focused on that. I didn't mean to, I said Sinjar is just the latest in that. But they felt that they were losing ground. There was pressure on the territory of the Islamic State. Now we're going to do something else, because we're not a one-trick pony. We just don't stick there, and we're going to show that we can strike you where it really hurts.
As The Observer shows on its front page, there's still a huge military presence where Leila is tonight in Paris, but the Sunday Express suggests that in London, the SAS is on our streets. Nabila, is that something that would unnerve you, knowing that there's perhaps plain-clothed, armed soldiers protecting British cities, or does it actually make you feel a little bit safer?
Well, we've heard the French president using the language of war, saying, this was an act of war perpetrated against France, that France was determined to fight terrorism, in a merciless fashion. And this has been echoed by his British counterpart, David Cameron, who is, just doing the same, proving that he's being pragmatic about it. He doesn't want to be complacent about it. Obviously, the British people are going to be scared about what's happened next doors. It's only 2 hours away on the Eurostar. And there are legitimate concerns about the British population, not least of all because Britain has gone through that a few years ago, and they certainly do not want to see a similar scenario unfold again on British soil. So what David Cameron is doing effectively is his policy is now revolving on war, and he's, taking all the security measures he possibly can to reassure the British public.
Nabila, many thanks. Also thanks to you. Good to see you again, Robert. And very many thanks to Leila as well for joining us from Paris tonight. Our thoughts are with you all and your colleagues and the people of Paris. Thank you very much for taking us through the papers, and thanks to you for watching as well. Continuous coverage on BBC News. Don't go away.